All right, so we're going to continue on with integrative mindfulness and emotional regulation strategies. One of the things that we know is that following trauma, our bodies, our emotions, our sensations, all of those things can drastically change. We've spoken about kind of that hyperarousal response and the hypoarousal response and how we flip our lid. And one of the things that we need to understand is that following trauma, our body may actually be a sense of discomfort, causing us to disconnect from feel. There may have been overwhelming or tremendous pain that may have caused that to come about. And one of the reasons it's important to kind of recognize this is, at the time, that's an adaptive survival-driven response, which serves a purpose, but unfortunately what happens quite often over time is that those states become traits. And although they were helpful and adaptive at the time, they often aren't necessary, to the same degree in the present day, and that's when it tends to become problematic. So for example, if we're becoming really agitated and, by something small and flipping our lid as though there's real life threat, that can really cause, harm and disruption within families as well. So what we need to understand is that those responses are survival driven, they're adaptive, they're not conscious. However, when we become conscious of those responses and when we're able to treat the underlying issues, then we can reduce the arousal and start reframing those associations, forming new neural pathways and new neural networks. We know that trauma stimulates our physiological responses, so we have our adrenaline response, which is key for fight or flight. We also have our freeze systems that cause us to shut down or go into more of that hypoaroused state. And our bodies really do remember that these responses were helpful and effective for us at the time. So I remember working with somebody years ago around a sexual trauma, and he said, I can forgive the 3, 4, 5-year-old that this happened to, right? I couldn't do anything about that. I can't forgive the 14, 15-year-old. Because what he had been telling himself for the past 50 years is that it was his fault, right? That he should have fought back. He was big, he was strong, he was fast, he should have run away. And really, and that's where it's so great to have some of the psycho ed around trauma, is I said to him, I understand why you would feel that way and think that way, but this is what we know about the brain, right? We understand that with the brain there are associations and networks of associations that are formed. So when this trauma happened in childhood we know that freeze is the most common response because we typically can't fight off, or outrun what is happening. So often we will freeze. However, when this happens again later in life, the brain goes, oh, I remember this, and this is what I do in this situation. And it's going to gravitate to whatever it thinks is most likely to bring about that survival response. So clearly, that worked for them previously, although it may not, have preserved the emotional harm in the same way, it did keep them alive. Does that make sense? So it's helping people to understand those responses, but also to understand that we can change them, which I think is really, really critical to understand. With feelings in the body, so how we feel about our body is influenced by trauma and attachment. So quite often when our boundaries have been violated or harm has happened with our body, we can feel like our body's betrayed us, or it's not ours, or it's not comfortable to be within. But at the same time, part of our work is kind of restoring that connection with our body and recognizing actually the boundaries and containment that our body can provide for us. We have feelings that come up following trauma. Shame is very characteristic of trauma. Disgust, again, quite common depending on the type of trauma that we experience. And a lot of times anger, right? And all of these are normal, healthy, adaptive responses to trauma. Just again, longer term, they don't tend to stay adaptive, and we get stuck quite often looping in them, and that's where the problem is. So we want to help people move through it. Sometimes what happens, often what happens is we recognize there's discomfort. So if we come back to that kind of window of tolerance that we spoke about, quite often people will recognize that they don't feel okay now. They don't speak through the language of optimal arousal zone or hyper-aroused and hypo-aroused, but they know that they don't feel okay. They'll say, I feel crazy, or I don't feel right, or something's wrong with me, and then they'll tend to gravitate towards things that will make them feel better, right? And it makes sense. People do the best that they can with what they know, and when we have a lack of that knowledge or those resources around what to do, we tend to gravitate to things like alcohol or drugs or dangerous, risk-seeking behaviors. If I feel shut down or emotionally deadened inside, doing something that's very stimulatory or kind of exciting will bring about that sense of vitality. The problem with those, and what I tend to call those, I think it was Tara Brock's language that I first heard this through, only she describes it a little differently, is true versus false refuges, right? So a false refuge, I would say, is something that gives the illusion of helping, right? And a true refuge is something that truly does. So a false refuge, for example, I worked as an addictions counselor for years, and a false refuge would be the belief that, okay, well, when I use, it gets me out of my body, and then I don't have to think about the feelings, and I don't feel the same way. But when we play it through to the end and we really look at, okay, well, how much time is there truly benefit from this? And we map that out, and then we look at, okay, coming down, right? How we feel when we're coming down, how we feel when we realize that we've just binged on a whole bunch of food or blown a whole bunch of money or, drank a whole bunch and that wasn't what we wanted to do to our body. Then the shame, the guilt, all of that stuff that follows. Plus, the problem that we were trying to get rid of in the first place is still there, only those other feelings tend to just kind of further increase and make that situation bigger, right? And then we have that preoccupation with using again. So when we really map it all out, there's a deficit, right? And I think that's when, when we look at a false refuge, it gives the illusion or, a perceived temporary relief, but it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't do anything to help shift things. With, however, a true refuge, that's something that we do that actually does shift our affective state effectively and doesn't do things that are like not in alignment with our value base. So typically we're not left feeling shame or guilt or blame. Instead, what we're feeling is empowerment, right? Or strength because we've done something that feels true for us and it's bringing about relief. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. And quite often these reactions that we have, again, are adaptations. So we see these adaptations and we often feel, shame or guilt around the responses that come up, not recognizing that these are born out of survival, right? Or caregivers or family members, we don't understand it. We just want the behavior to stop, right? And part of the understanding is that it served a purpose and we're kind of stuck in that process until we can replace it with something else and reduce the arousal. Disconnecting from our body, so we know that our body can be a tremendous source of emotional and physical pain, and when that's the case, and this is true for babies, right, when we leave them to cry, we now know that they go into a dorsal vagal shutdown state, and it's actually the roots of dissociation because there's such tremendous pain and they're entirely reliant on their parents and caregivers to regulate them, right? So when they don't have that and they have that tremendous pain, they stop crying. So a lot of times parents think, well, they've settled themselves. They don't know how to settle themselves. And what they've done is their little bodies and brains are actually flooded with cortisol, right? And they go into a shutdown or dissociative state. And again, we do the best that we can with what we know. It was messaged for a long time by medical practitioners, even and doctors, that it's good to let your baby cry out. So there are still, many people out there who parented that way and encourage this parenting, right? You're going to spoil your baby if you pick them up. But we now know that this isn't true, that babies are entirely reliant on their caregivers to help them self-regulate, right? Or not self-regulate, co-regulate. And that process teaches them what that calm arousal is like, and then they start to learn as they get older what brings them back to that state. And when we have that leads to resilience and neuroprotection and grows our brain. When we have had this emotional pain throughout the lifespan or in early childhood, we can see certain responses that will bring about adaptations. So maybe something like throat tightness or constriction, or my heart beating really fast, or my tummy turning will remind me of something bad that happened, so it will make me disconnect from my body. So maybe even at the beginning of feeling that, I'll start to shut down and go into that hypo-aroused state. Or I may have activation that happens and then shut down. So we tend to kind of oscillate between those states. And that often will be, when we talk about the window of tolerance, we know the more that we experience trauma, the smaller and smaller that window becomes. So, it can be very, very slight things that cause us to go into those, arousal states. And again, my tolerance to stay in a hyper-aroused state might be very small. So I may experience activation, feel like I'm going to have a panic attack, but as soon as I go into that panic attack, I dissociate because I don't want to feel. I can't hold the feeling of that intense kind of activation. So part of our work is helping people reconnect with the body, which is so challenging. But one of the things that I say to people, we get so many people who come to us and they've had tremendous pain happen and they've had unhealthy relationships, and they'll say, you know, I really don't want to be in the same kind of situations again. And I'll say, you know, one of the main reasons I want you to feel your feelings is because we have this thing called our gut instinct or our intuition, and our intuition helps us to really actively, quite often, read in a given situation. When we're shut off from feel, we're missing that, right? So really, truly, if we want to be protecting ourselves, one of the best ways we can do that is by being in our body and then honoring what comes up, which is also very hard because if our boundaries have been violated, or we felt that we haven't had a voice, or we felt like our voice doesn't matter, you know, again, there are all kinds of associations that go with that. But that's a big part of the work that we do at our center, is helping to form those neural pathways and using voice and moving through kind of immobilized states or constriction or shutdown states. You know, also understanding that feelings are part of being a human being, right? They just are. I once had a lawyer say to me, so you evoke distress in the children you work with? And I said, no, I don't evoke distress, but I do allow it, right? Because it is part of being a human being. And this is where I think the challenge with medication comes in, because medication inhibits and blocks quite often our ability to feel our feelings. And unfortunately, sometimes if it's paired with psychotherapy, we see shifts with that and people are building competencies. But a lot of times what happens is people are disconnected from feel, they take medication, they stop taking medication, and they haven't built tools or skills to manage their emotions, so they can't, right? Over the long term, they can't. Whereas if we're working on building connection to the body and awareness and teaching people how to hold anger without hurting themselves or hurting somebody else and going into that kind of explosive, hyper-aroused state, or, you know, an internalizing, shutdown, dissociative, hypo-aroused state, then we build a broadened window of tolerance so I can feel that feeling and, you know, step into it and release it in a safe and effective way that doesn't hurt self or others. Same with sadness or rejection or fear, right? Those things happen in life. And I want people to have the tools that when that does happen later in life, because it will, we're able to feel that feeling without destabilizing. So our body doesn't only hold the past traumas, it also has the capacity to heal them. And again, this is why, you know, our approach is so integrative, and we do the somatic discharging work and we help people become aware of what they're feeling, because we want them to notice those shifts that are happening, you know, when relief is occurring or grounding is occurring or joy is occurring. Even if it's for only 1 to 2 seconds, we want them to be aware of those shifts, because their brain is so acutely aware of the pain, the threat, the sadness. It is not aware of the relief that's happening. We need to consciously help it to tap into that. So I've touched on some of this already, but why we need to notice our sensations. So we want to distinguish sensations from negative cognitions or beliefs. We want to stay in the present, in here and now, and our senses and our body sensations are a great way to do this. You know, breath work, again, is a really, really powerful way to ground in the here and now. It's free, it's portable, it's incredibly effective. Awareness of our body sensations also helps us when we're starting to feel kind of like outside of ourselves. There's breath work we can do that can instantly bring us back into our body. CRM, the comprehensive resource model that we use, is really, really great for this as well. If we're feeling confused, if we're feeling disorientated, if we're feeling disconnected, all of these are things that help kind of, you know, to keep us in that trauma looping state. And if we can shift that through using our senses, then we can often shift that affective state. So we spoke about smell, you know, a few sessions ago, and just the fact that smell is a very powerful way to help people become embodied. And I'll often ask people as we're doing our trauma processing work, are you able to feel your feet connected to the ground? Right? Again, the strategies don't have to be big and long. If they say yes, I'm going to say, are you okay to continue? If they say no, I might have them breathe in some essential oils and ask again, are you able to feel your feet connected to the ground, right? If they say yes, are you okay to continue? And on we go. What we want to be mindful of doing or not doing is sometimes what happens is we notice activation when we're doing this work and we're helping people move through their experiences, and we've lit up all those neural pathways, and then because there's some activation or some, drifting towards the edges of disembodiment, we stop, right? And if we stop doing that processing there, what we've done is just lit up everything and sent them home, right? What we need to be mindful of doing is playing it through to the end, and that's really what our approach focuses on in a safe, structured, titrated way, so that we have the activation. We want to be working at the edges of that activation. So we're not flooding people, and we're not sending them into a dissociative or shutdown state, but they're at the edges, right, of that window of tolerance, and we're just trying to ever so slightly broaden it to teach them that they have the capacity to feel their feelings and to stay with them and to notice those feelings. And I think, again, with military and EMS populations, it's a challenge, right? Because again, in the role in the workplace, they need to be in that survival state, in that survival mode. But the challenge happens when we transition to home and we're still responding as though there's actual life threat in our environment where there's not actual life threat, right? So this is really critical for helping people connect to their body, notice what sticks with them, notice, the transition from one place to another, learning how to ground and be present in the environment to feel what they're feeling. And sometimes people worry, well, if I do that, then I'm going to go crazy because, they're doing really, really hard work. The same could be true for counseling or other roles, paramedics, first response. The reality is we adapt to our roles, right? So if seeing death, such as, working even, what we had the other day was an example of working in the morgue, right? If that's part of our role, we adapt to it and it becomes part of our role. But one of the challenges is, if we're not in tune with our body, we don't notice when there's the one-off that sticks and it hits us differently, and that's the stuff that takes up space and stays with us and is, really shrinking that window of tolerance. So if I'm attuned to my body and I can look at it and go, okay, what was different about, this day or this, trip that I was on or this work shift or whatever it may be, then I can scan back through that and process that piece and discharge it because it's not mine, right? Or reframe it or reflect on it and look at what's happening here that's different. So again, really, really important. And when we do that, we're not carrying stuff, right, the same way. So we have more room and space to deal with the day-to-day in our, home life and to be present in our home life when we're there. So I just want to go through different activities that are really good for helping us to connect to our body, to promote regulation or to promote stimulation. And again, a lot of these strategies are not, it's just to introduce them, right? What works for one person may not work for somebody else, and that's okay, but we don't know until we try. So what I often suggest with clients is I'll introduce them to a bunch of things. They let me know what works for them, right? So when we do this, I just invite a gentle noticing. It's not a judgment, it's just an observation. What happens when I do this, right? We don't need to analyze it, we don't need to break it down. We just want to notice, oh, when I do this, it feels grounding for me. Or when I do this, it feels comforting for me. Or when I do this, it feels uncomfortable for me. So we just want to kind of recognize. And keeping that in mind, when we try something new, often it does feel uncomfortable. So it's trying to distinguish from is this uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar, or is this uncomfortable because it really just doesn't feel good for me? If it's unfamiliar, sometimes we need to practice it once or twice to really just kind of see, how does this feel for me and how does this work for me? If it really is something that feels like, no, this is not good and safe for me, then we don't do it, right? And ultimately, this is about adding tools to our toolkit so we have more and more things that we can use. Because even if we find something that works really well, it may work really well for one feeling or situation, and then another feeling or situation of a different magnitude, it may not work for. So we want more than one tool or two or three or four or even 10 in our toolkit. We want to have lots, right? And a lot of the clients that I work with, because they're coming out of such such horrific trauma and layers of trauma, they'll layer the techniques, right? They'll find what works for them and they'll use 2 or 3 of them all combined at once to help them move through those overwhelming emotions. So this is Peter Levine's work, and he has a few kind of self-holding exercises that he does. One of them is just, and I'd invite you just to try if you're comfortable doing so, and just noticing, right, how it feels. He would typically have you do this until you notice some kind of shift in your body. If we're connected to our bodies, a lot of times we'll feel that shift really quick. So I'm not going to talk through the next ones, I'm just going to guide you through them visually, and just notice, right? Notice whether it's grounding, whether it's soothing, whether it's activating. Play with it a little bit and find what works for you. So this one, you're just putting your hands, and with each of these you're going to put gentle pressure. So it's almost like a holding, right? So just a gentle pressure. Just take a breath. Just notice. And we can shift one hand to the back of our head, one hand to the forehead. And again, just noticing. And noticing if you bring one hand now onto our chest and one hand on our forehead. One hand down to our belly, one hand on our chest. And then one hand on the back of our head and one hand on our belly. And just coming back to the room whenever you're ready and pausing to notice. How did that feel for you? Did they feel the same? Did they feel different? What did you notice if you're comfortable sharing?
I think it felt really good.
Yeah.
I like moving my head and my heart, kind of like connecting the brain.
I find that really grounding, actually.
I love that one.
Yeah, and it's just finding, and again, the really cool thing about these is when we find what works for us, we don't have to sit here for 20 minutes, right? Sometimes we don't have time to do that, we're not in a space to do that. But, just knowing that this is something that's soothing for me, or maybe this is comforting for me, or maybe this, this feels nice when we have a headache, actually, or this can feel nice for me, at least when I have a headache. So it's knowing those little tools and then kind of weaving them in as you need them. Yeah. What did you notice?
I noticed each area was completely different.
Yeah.
The sensation that came over you, and even like, as you were having it, in this area, just recognizing where your breath was. What was I feeling,
Yes.
And even the elongation, like of my spine, and then when I was on my heart, it was, so it was really a beautiful technique,
Yes.
I like them all, like as a flow.
Yeah, like a flow.
Yeah. And we went through them kind of quickly, and on your own, you don't have to do that. You can settle into it, right? But the other thing that you want to notice, and I'm sure, Lisa, you have an appreciation for this, is the different energy meridians and the different, pressure points that we're touching. All of that does something different with our body, right? So as we're shifting things, that has an impact. So
I noticed this position was my favorite too, but it was the heat from my hand on my forehead. It felt so comforting. It felt like a parent's hand somehow.
And and this is where everyone's different. As soon as I do this, every time I do this, I feel just a cooling, grounding sensation go through me. I feel heat when I do this, right? So everyone will experience something different, and this is where it's not prescriptive. I can't say what this is going to do for you. I can't tell you this will be comforting or, helpful for you when you're feeling activated. You are the best judge of you, right? So it's about trying different things and
As
finding
well
what
as I
works.
feel like, it depends on the time and place.
Absolutely.
Of what you're feeling and which one would be more
For which
appropriate,
emotions.
right? Yeah, that feeling.
Yeah, and
just
that's what we
going
want the
into it.
tools, right?
Yes.
Lots of different
Yes.
tools. So when something doesn't work, we have more. We want to be able to explore and sit with the different body sensations, right? Noticing activation. What brings that about? What is uncomfortable for us? How do we learn how to kind of step into that? And again, we're not kind of, sometimes people with trauma work, and this is where it can be dangerous, do too much, too deep, too fast. That's really dangerous, because what we do is we send people, into those states that they often have gone into, that flooding and hyper-aroused state. And sometimes people will say, well, I feel like you're just gonna rip everything open. That's not what you do in good trauma processing. You're stepping into it a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And what we're doing as we do that is we're building the ability to feel our feelings without destabilizing, right? We're noticing what's causing us to want to shut down or fall asleep or feel like we need to escape. And how can we kind of sit with that just a little tiny bit longer and to see if we do that, is it okay, right? And that's how we help kind of train our brain away from some of those adaptive responses that served a purpose then, but aren't serving a purpose, or were needed then, but aren't needed to the same degree now, right? And that's really what I've kind of said there. So I want to do a little body mapping exercise with you. There's paper on the table and different art supplies. And what I'm going to invite you to do is just draw a body outline. I often just draw like a gingerbread kind of figure. We're not analyzing your artwork. I'm not analyzing your drawings. This is just about the process, not about the product. And just start by drawing a body outline. And what I would invite you to do once you have this drawn, and I'm just going to explain it now so you can work at your own pace, is just do a scan, kind of from head to toe. We're not going to do this really slow and deep because, again, for people who've experienced trauma, taking them fully into their body is just not something that often feels safe. So you do this to the degree that feels comfortable for you, but the idea would be if you could kind of do a quick scan through your body and just notice what's there. Notice any tension, any tightness, any comfort, any activation, any groundedness. What do you feel and where do you feel it? And try to consider, with those body sensations, if they had a color, if they had a texture, what might that be? And put it wherever you notice it, right? So if it feels spiky, you can give it spiky edges. If it feels, smooth and swirly and lovely and soft or expansive, you can do that too. But it's just kind of noticing and allowing for whatever is there.